We imagine Rome in marble. We see grand columns, clean togas, and heroic generals. We think of law, order, and engineering marvels. The Colosseum, the aqueducts, the roads that connected the world. But what if that picture is mostly a fantasy? What if the daily reality for the average Roman was noisy, filthy, and dangerous? What did the city actually smell like with a million people and no real sanitation system? What were your odds of surviving to your fifth birthday? And what happened if you were accused of a crime? The truth is far stranger and much more unsettling than the movies show us. The gleaming empire was built on a foundation of things we would find unbearable. It was a world where life was cheap, privacy didn't exist, and danger was always around the corner. Forget the Hollywood epics. This is a look at the grit, the grime, and the sheer weirdness of everyday Roman life. Number 20. What was hiding in your drinking water? The aqueducts are symbols of Roman genius. They carried fresh water for miles, a feat of engineering that supplied the city's fountains, baths, and wealthy homes. It seems clean and advanced. But the water itself could be a slow poison. The Romans were masters of plumbing, and their material of choice was lead. They made vast networks of lead pipes called fistulae to distribute water from the main aqueducts. The Roman architect Vitruvius, writing in the 1st century BC, actually warned against this. In his work, De Architectura, he noted that water from earthenware pipes was healthier than water from lead ones. He observed the poor health of lead workers who had pale complexions. He knew something was wrong, but his warnings were largely ignored. His lead was just too useful. It was easy to mine, easy to shape, and durable, so they used it for everything. Pipes, cooking pots, cups, and even cosmetics. Wealthy Romans had extensive plumbing in their homes, meaning they got a constant, low-level dose of lead every time they drank or bathed. But it gets worse. One of the most popular sweeteners in the Roman world was a syrup called sapa or de frutum. It was made by boiling down grape juice in, you guessed it, lead pots. This process caused lead acetate, a compound sometimes called sugar of lead, to leach into the syrup. It was intensely sweet. They used it to preserve fruit, sweeten wine, and flavor their food. It was the Roman equivalent of high fructose corn syrup, and it was everywhere. Historians like Jerome Riagu, in his 1983 book, Lead and Lead Poisoning in Antiquity, argued that widespread lead poisoning was a major factor in the decline of the Roman Empire. He suggested it caused gout, sterility, and mental decay, especially among the aristocracy who consumed the most lead-laced wine and used the most extensive lead plumbing. While many historians now think this is an oversimplification, the evidence of lead poisoning is undeniable. The studies of Roman skeletons have found lead levels many times higher than those in modern humans. They suffered from a chronic, low-grade poisoning that would have caused joint pain, developmental problems in children, kidney failure, and cognitive decline. They were slowly poisoning themselves with their own advanced technology. They saw the aqueducts as a sign of their power over nature. But inside those great structures flowed a hidden danger that affected their health for generations. So we are left with some chilling questions. Did the Roman elite's famous eccentricity and cruelty, like that of emperors such as Caligula or Nero, have a chemical cause? Was their empire in a way weakened from the inside out by the very material they used to build it? And how many common ailments and early deaths were simply the result of drinking a cup of sweetened wine with no one ever knowing the cause? Number 19, could you really be executed for writing a bad poem? Freedom of speech was not a Roman concept. While politicians in the Senate might debate fiercely, for the average person, saying the wrong thing about the wrong person could get you killed. The law was a tool of power, and it was used to crush dissent, personal insults, and anything that smelled of treason. Under the early laws of the 12 Tables, which date back to the 5th century BC, it was a capital crime to compose a carmen, which could mean a song, a poem, or an incantation that brought dishonor or disgrace upon another person. Well, basically, you could be clubbed to death for libel. This tradition of punishing speech continued and got much worse under the emperors. The concept of majestas, or diminished majesty, became a terrifyingly vague and powerful weapon. Originally, it meant treason against the Roman state, like helping an enemy or inciting a mutiny. But under emperors like Tiberius, it was expanded to include any perceived insult against the emperor or his family. A poorly timed joke, a complaint about taxes, or even praising one of the emperor's enemies like Brutus, could be interpreted as treason. The historian Tacitus in his Annals chronicles the reign of terror under Tiberius, where informers known as delatores thrived. These men would listen for any grumbling or criticism of the emperor. They would then report the person to the authorities, and if the accused was convicted, the informer would receive a share of their confiscated property. This created a paranoid society where people were afraid to speak freely, even in their own homes. The punishments were horrific. For the upper classes, it might mean exile and the loss of all property. For the lower classes, it often meant death. You could be thrown to wild beasts in the arena, burned alive, or crucified. The poet Ovid was famously exiled by Emperor Augustus in 8 AD to a remote town on the Black Sea. At his crime, he said it was for a poem and a mistake. The poem was likely Ars Amatoria, the art of love, a work seen as scandalous. The mistake is still a mystery, but it shows how an artist's work could lead to their ruin. Another historian, Suetonius, writes that the Emperor Caligula would sometimes force writers of works he disliked to lick their words off the parchment or be drowned in the Tiber River. Whether this is an exaggeration or not, it reflects the very real fear people lived under. Your words were not your own. They belonged to the state, and if the state disliked them, you paid the price. This leaves us wondering about the art and history we have lost. How many brilliant historians, poets, and philosophers simply chose silence over the risk of death? What truths about the emperors and the state were never written down out of pure fear? And how much of the Roman history that survives is simply official propaganda, the version of the story that the powerful allowed to be told? Number 18, did Romans really do their business together? Yes, they did, and it was far stranger than you can imagine. Roman public toilets, or foraci, were not places of privacy. They were social hubs. Imagine a large room with long marble or wooden benches running along the walls. Holes were cut into these benches, spaced just a little way apart. There were no stalls, no partitions, no doors. You would sit right next to a stranger or a friend and conduct your business in full view of everyone else. These latrines could often seat dozens of people at a time. The remains of these communal toilets can still be seen in places like Ostia Antica, the port of Rome, or Ephesus in modern-day Turkey. Underneath the bench was a channel of constantly running water, which carried the waste away into a larger sewer system, like the famous Cloaca Maxima. This sounds advanced, but it had its downsides. The smell would have been overwhelming. And there was a constant risk of things coming up from the sewer. There are accounts of rats and other creatures emerging from the toilet holes, sometimes biting the users. There was also the problem of gas buildup in the sewers below. Pockets of methane could ignite, causing flames to shoot up through the holes. Roman writers like Claudius Aelianus mentioned this phenomenon. People were genuinely afraid of their toilets exploding. And what about toilet paper? It didn't exist. Instead, the Romans used a tersorium or xylospongium. This was a natural sea sponge attached to the end of a stick. After finishing your business, you would use this tool to clean yourself. And here's the most unsettling part: the tersorium was communal. It was shared by everyone in the latrine. Between uses, it was kept in a bucket of salt water or vinegar in the center of the room. This practice, documented by writers like Seneca the Younger, who wrote about a gladiator committing suicide with one, would have been an incredibly effective way to spread intestinal parasites and diseases like cholera and typhoid. Archaeological analysis of preserved Roman sewage from places like Herculaneum has confirmed the presence of whipworm, roundworm, and other parasites. Their advanced engineering couldn't save them from the consequences of their unhygienic habits. For the Romans, going to the toilet was a public, social, and surprisingly hazardous activity. So, what did they talk about while sitting there together? Did they conduct business deals or just exchange local gossip? We also have to wonder, given the known dangers and lack of hygiene, how many people avoided the public latrines altogether and simply used a pot at home, which they then emptied into the street? And perhaps most disturbingly, how much did the shared sponge contribute to the constant plagues and diseases that swept through the Roman world, killing millions? Number 17, why were the streets a deadly obstacle course? Walking through a Roman city was not a pleasant stroll. It was a chaotic and dangerous experience. The streets were narrow, crowded, and filthy. The first problem was the traffic. During the day, the noise was constant. The poet Martial, who wrote in the late 1st century AD, complained endlessly about the noise of the city, from the hammering of coppersmiths to the shouts of vendors. Julius Caesar actually banned most wheeled carts and chariots from the city of Rome during the hours of daylight to try and combat the gridlock. The law, the Lex Iulia Municipalis, was a good idea in theory, but in practice it just meant that all the heavy transport happened at night. The poet Juvenal, in his Satyrs, describes the nightmare of trying to sleep in Rome. He writes about the rumbling of wagons, the curses of drivers stuck in the narrow alleys, and the sheer impossibility of getting any rest. The second danger was what came from above. Most Romans lived in tall, rickety apartment buildings called insulae. These buildings had no indoor plumbing. So what did people do with their household waste and human excrement? They threw it out the window. There were laws against this, and you could be sued if your waste injured someone, but it happened all the time. Juvenal describes the prudent man as one who makes his will before going out to dinner at night, for fear of being killed by a falling chamber pot. The streets were effectively open sewers, filled with garbage, animal carcasses, and human waste. People walked on raised stepping stones to try and keep their feet out of the muck. And then there was the crime. There was no professional police force in Rome in the modern sense. The city was policed by the urban cohorts and the vigils, but they were more like a combination of soldiers and firefighters focused on riots and major disturbances, not petty crime. Muggings, assaults, and burglaries were rampant, especially after dark. The streets were unlit. Wealthy Romans would never go out at night without a group of armed slaves carrying torches to protect them. For the poor, walking home alone in the dark was a life-threatening risk. The satirist Petronius, in his work The Satyricon, gives a vivid picture of the Roman underworld, a place of thugs, thieves, and con artists. The city was a place of extreme contrast. Magnificent public buildings stood next to squalid slums, and the rule of law existed alongside daily violence and chaos. This reality of urban life raises some serious questions. How did the average Roman cope with the constant sensory overload, the noise, the smell, the crowds? With the streets being so dangerous, did most people, especially women and the elderly, simply stay in their homes after sunset, effectively living under a self-imposed curfew? And if the city was so unlivable by our standards, why did hundreds of thousands of people continue to flock to Rome, trading the relative peace of the countryside for the deadly chaos of the capital? Number 16, what did a doctor's visit actually involve? Getting sick in ancient Rome was a terrifying prospect. Roman medicine was a mixture of practical knowledge, folk remedies, and heavy superstition. If you went to see a doctor or medicus, you were putting your life in very uncertain hands. There was no formal regulation or licensing for doctors. Anyone could claim to be one. Many were Greeks, and some were highly educated, following the teachings of Hippocrates and Galen. But many others were quacks and charlatans. The writer Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, expresses a deep distrust of doctors, complaining about their high fees, their conflicting theories, and their often fatal treatments. Their surgical procedures were performed without anesthesia, except for perhaps a dose of wine or opium to dull the pain. Patients had to be physically held down. Surgical tools like saws for amputation, scalpels, and hooks were surprisingly sophisticated, as examples found at Pompeii show. But without any concept of germ theory, the risk of infection was immense. A successful surgery could easily be followed by a fatal case of gangrene. The Roman army actually had some of the most skilled surgeons, as they had constant practice treating wounds on the battlefield. The Medici in the legions were skilled at extracting arrows, stitching wounds, and performing amputations. For common illnesses, the treatments could be bizarre and disgusting. Epilepsy, known as the falling sickness, was sometimes treated by drinking the fresh, warm blood of a slain gladiator. It was believed this would transfer the gladiator's vitality to the patient. Pliny the Elder records this cure, though he seems skeptical. Cabbage was considered a cure all for everything from ulcers to deafness. Animal dung was a common ingredient in poultices. Electric rays were used for shock therapy to treat headaches and gout. Roman dentistry was mostly limited to extraction. A toothache meant having the tooth pulled without painkillers, using a brutal-looking pair of forceps. Life expectancy was shockingly low. While a Roman who reached adulthood might live into their 50s or 60s, the average life expectancy at birth was only around 25 years. This was largely due to an astronomical infant mortality rate. Perhaps as many as half of all Roman children died before the age of 10 from diseases like dysentery, diphtheria, and malaria. The Romans had no vaccines, no antibiotics, and no real understanding of how diseases spread. They relied on appeals to the gods, especially Apollo the healer or the goddess Salus, as much as they did on medicine. For most Romans, a serious illness was a death sentence. This leads to some profound questions about their mindset. How did people live with such a high probability of their children dying? Did the constant presence of death make them more fatalistic or more religious? And with medicine being so unreliable and often dangerous, was the best survival strategy for a sick Roman simply to do nothing and hope for the best? Number 15, was your dinner trying to kill you? For the vast majority of Romans, food was a monotonous and often unhealthy affair. While we have images of lavish banquets from authors like Petronius with exotic dishes like dormice stuffed with pork and poppies, this was the reality for only the tiny, super-rich elite. The average Roman citizen, the plebeian, survived on a simple, grain-based diet. Their staple food was pulses, a kind of porridge made from emmer wheat, water, and salt. It was bland, but it was cheap. This was often supplemented with whatever vegetables they could get, like cabbage, onions, or lentils, and perhaps a little cheese or a piece of fruit. Meat was a luxury. The poor might get some pork on a special occasion or during a public festival, but it was not a regular part of their diet. Their main source of protein was often a pungent, fermented fish sauce called garum or liquamen. And garum was the ketchup of the Roman world. It was made by layering fish, especially the guts and heads of fish like mackerel and anchovies, with salt in large vats and leaving them to ferment in the sun for several months. The liquid that drained off was the garum. It was an industrial-scale operation, with factories all around the Mediterranean, and the ruins of one can be seen clearly in Pompeii. The smell from these factories must have been unimaginable. While it sounds disgusting to us, it provided essential salts and amino acids, but it was also a likely source of intestinal parasites if not prepared correctly. The way food was prepared also posed a health risk. As mentioned before, the use of lead cooking pots could poison food. But there was also a lack of hygiene. Food sold on the streets in Thermopylae, the Roman equivalent of fast food stands, was often prepared in unsanitary conditions. Adulteration was common. Unscrupulous merchants might add cheap fillers to flour or water down wine. Access to fresh, clean food was a constant struggle. The city of Rome depended on huge shipments of grain, the annona, from provinces like Egypt and North Africa. If these shipments were delayed by storms or war, the price of bread would skyrocket and riots could break out. The emperor's power depended on keeping the populace fed, a policy known as bread and circuses. But the bread they were getting was often coarse and basic, and the nutrition was poor. Evidence from skeletal remains shows that many ordinary Romans suffered from malnutrition, iron deficiency, anemia, and dental problems from their gritty, abrasive diet. We have to ask, what did it really taste like to eat a Roman meal? Was the flavor of garum so overwhelming that it masked the taste of everything else? How did the poor supplement their meager diet, and what wild plants or small animals did they forage to survive? And ultimately, did the constant struggle for basic nutrition shape the Roman character, making them tougher and more resilient, or simply more desperate? Number 14, what happened when the fire alarm was a scream? In Roman cities were tinderboxes. The apartment buildings, or insulae, where most of the population lived, were poorly constructed and dangerously overcrowded. They were often 6 or 7 stories high, built with cheap timber frames, wattle and daub walls, and tile roofs. The upper floors were particularly flimsy. Fire was a constant, terrifying threat. People used open flames for everything, cooking on braziers in their small apartments, lighting their homes with oil lamps, and heating rooms with charcoal. A knocked-over lamp or a stray spark could easily set an entire building ablaze. Once a fire started, it spread with horrifying speed. The narrow streets acted like wind tunnels, fanning the flames and allowing them to jump from one insula to the next. There was no organized, citywide fire department for much of Roman history. The first real attempt to create one was the Triumviri Nocturni in the 3rd century BC, but they were ineffective. The real breakthrough came with the Emperor Augustus in 6 AD after a particularly devastating fire. He established the Vigiles Urbani, a corps of around 7,000 freedmen who acted as both firefighters and a night watch. But even the Vigiles were limited. Their equipment was primitive by our standards. They had buckets, axes, and long poles with hooks to pull down burning buildings and create fire breaks. They also used large cloth blankets soaked in water and rudimentary pumps, or siphons, that could shoot a jet of water but not very far or with much force. Their main strategy was often containment rather than extinguishing. They would demolish the buildings around a fire to stop its spread, which was not always popular with the property owners. And there was a dark side. The famous triumvir Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the richest men in Roman history, made a fortune from fire. He had his own private fire brigade of 500 slaves. When a building caught fire, Crassus would rush to the scene and offer to buy the burning building, and sometimes the neighboring ones for a ridiculously low price. If the desperate owner agreed, his men would put out the fire. If not, they would stand by and watch it burn. The most famous fire in Roman history was the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD during the reign of Emperor Nero. The historian Tacitus describes how the fire raged for 6 days, destroying huge swathes of the city. He writes of the chaos and panic, the shrieks of women, and the helplessness of the people. Nero was accused of starting the fire himself, perhaps to clear land for his new palace, the Domus Aurea, though Tacitus is ambivalent. To deflect blame, Nero targeted the city's small Christian community, accusing them of arson and subjecting them to horrific public executions. This event shows how a natural disaster could be instantly politicized and turned into an excuse for brutal persecution. For the average Roman, the cry of fire was one of the most dreaded sounds they could hear. This constant threat leaves us with some unsettling questions. How often did fires actually break out? Was it a weekly or even daily occurrence in a city as large as Rome? When a fire destroyed an entire neighborhood, where did the now homeless thousands of people go? And did ruthless landlords or developers ever intentionally set fires to clear out slums, a practice that has been suspected in many cities throughout history? Number 13, could your own father legally kill you? The Roman family was built on a concept called patria potestatis, or the power of the father. This was a legal principle enshrined in the 12 Tables that gave the male head of the household, the paterfamilias' absolute life and death authority over his entire extended family. This included his wife, his sons, and their wives, his unmarried daughters, his grandchildren, and all the family's slaves and property. This power was absolute and lasted for his entire life. A son, even if he was a grown man, a married father himself, and a powerful senator, was still legally under his father's control as long as his father was alive. He could not own property in his own name. Anything he earned or acquired technically belonged to his father. The paterfamilias had the right to arrange his children's marriages, sell them into slavery, or even kill them. This right, the vitae necisque potestas power of life and death, was the most extreme expression of his authority. While it was rarely used in later Roman history and was socially frowned upon, the fact that it existed legally is shocking. There are historical examples of it being carried out. The historian Livy tells the story of Spurius Cassius Vicellinius, a consul who was accused of aiming for kingship. After his term of office, his own father put him on trial in their home, found him guilty, and had him executed. Another famous, perhaps legendary, case involved Aulus Fulvius, whose son joined the conspiracy of Catiline in 63 BC. Aulus had his son dragged back from his journey and put to death, stating that he had begotten him, not for Catiline against his country, but for his country against Catiline. A more common and horrifying practice was infant exposure. If a newborn child was deformed, weak, or simply an unwanted girl, as daughters required a dowry and could not carry on the family name, the paterfamilias had the right to refuse to raise it. The baby would be taken and left outside, exposed to the elements, to die or be picked up by slave traders. This was a common and socially accepted form of family planning and quality control. The law saw the child as the father's property, and he could dispose of it as he saw fit. While maternal love surely existed, the legal and social structure of the family was patriarchal and brutal to a degree that is hard for us to comprehend. The family was not a haven of love and support, it was a miniature kingdom ruled by a king with absolute power. So, how often was the power of life and death actually used against adult children? Was it a genuine threat or more of a legal fossil that reminded everyone of the father's ultimate authority? We also have to wonder about the psychological effect this had on Roman sons. How did it feel to be a 40-year-old magistrate commanding legions or governing provinces but still unable to make a major personal decision without your father's consent? And what happened in families where the paterfamilias was cruel, greedy, or senile, holding his entire family hostage to his whims? Number 12. Why were the gods so terrifying? Roman religion was not about faith or morality in the modern sense. It was a contractual relationship with a vast pantheon of gods, spirits, and divine forces that controlled every aspect of life. And these gods were not necessarily benevolent, they were powerful, temperamental, and easily offended. The core of Roman religion was Pax Diorum, the peace of the gods. The goal was to keep the gods happy through precise rituals, prayers, and sacrifices. If the rituals were performed correctly, the gods would be favorable to Rome. If they were neglected, or if someone did something to anger them, the gods would punish the entire community with plague, famine, or military defeat. This made religion a matter of public anxiety. This fear manifested in a deep-seated belief in omens, portents, and prodigies. The Romans believed the gods sent signs to warn them of impending disaster. An eclipse, a lightning strike on a temple, a cow giving birth to a two-headed calf, all of these were seen as terrifying messages from the divine world. A special college of priests, the augurs, would interpret the flight of birds to determine if the gods approved of a certain course of action. Another group, the haruspices, would inspect the entrails, especially the liver, of sacrificed animals. A deformed or discolored liver could halt a military campaign or cancel an election. The historian Suetonius reports that on the day of his assassination, Julius Caesar was warned by a soothsayer, and that the sacrifices he performed that morning produced a series of unfavorable omens, including a bull without a heart. On a personal level, Romans lived in fear of curses and the evil eye. If you had a dispute with a neighbor or a rival in business, you could create a tabula defectionis, a curse tablet. These were small, thin sheets of lead on which you would write a curse, often calling on underworld deities like Pluto and Proserpina. You would then pierce the tablet with a nail, symbolizing the binding of your victim, and deposit it in a place thought to be close to the underworld, like a well, a spring, or a grave. Thousands of these tablets have been found by archaeologists across the Roman Empire. They contain vicious and specific curses. I curse Tretia Maria. May her mind, her memory, her liver, her lungs melt away. This was not a fringe practice, it was a common way of dealing with personal conflict. The Romans also wore amulets, like the bulla worn by boys or the fascinum, a phallic charm, to ward off evil spirits and bad luck. Their world was populated by ghosts, lemures, malevolent spirits, and unpredictable gods. It was a place of deep, pervasive superstition. This raises some unsettling questions about their daily lives. Did people live in a state of constant, low-level anxiety, always watching for bad omens or fearing a neighbor's curse? How much did this deep-seated superstition hold back scientific or rational thought? And when disasters like the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD occurred, did anyone see it as a natural event, or was it universally interpreted as the ultimate expression of divine rage? Number 11. What was life like for half the population? For women in ancient Rome, life was defined by legal and social constraints. They were citizens, but they could not vote, hold political office, or serve in the military. For her entire life, a Roman woman was under the legal control of a man. As a child, she was under the patria potestas of her father. When she married, she typically passed into the manus, the hand of her husband. Her property became his, and she was legally subject to his authority, while a form of marriage developed later that allowed her to remain under her father's authority and control her own property. She was never truly independent. The ideal Roman woman was a matrona, a dignified, faithful wife and mother who managed the household and raised virtuous children. Her world was the home, the domuses. Girls were often married very young, sometimes as early as 12 or 13, though 14 to 18 was more common. Marriages among the upper classes were almost always arranged. They were political and economic alliances designed to consolidate wealth and power between families. Love was not a primary consideration. The primary duty of a married woman was to produce legitimate children, especially sons, to continue the family line. This was an incredibly dangerous task. Childbirth was a leading cause of death for women. With no understanding of modern hygiene and limited medical knowledge, complications, infections, and postpartum hemorrhage were common. The epitaphs on Roman tombs often mourn young women who died in childbirth. While women were excluded from public political life, some influential women in the imperial family, like Livia, the wife of Augustus, or Agrippina the Younger, the mother of Nero, wielded immense power behind the scenes. They were often portrayed by male historians like Tacitus as cunning, manipulative, and ruthless, a reflection of Roman anxiety about women stepping outside their traditional roles. For ordinary women, life was one of domestic labor. They were responsible for spinning wool, managing the household slaves, and overseeing the education of young children. And education for girls was limited. They were taught to read and write and do basic arithmetic so they could manage a household, but higher education was reserved for boys. A woman's value was tied directly to her chastity before marriage and her fertility within it. The law harshly punished adultery for women, while men were largely free to have sexual relationships with slaves and prostitutes without social stigma. It was a world built by men, for men. This forces us to ask some difficult questions. What did Roman women think and feel about their constrained lives? Did they resent their lack of freedom, or did they accept it as the natural order? We have very few written sources from women themselves, so their voices are almost entirely lost to history. How did the power dynamics in an arranged marriage actually play out behind closed doors? And how did the constant threat of death in childbirth shape a woman's view of marriage, sex, and her own body? Number 10, were the famous Roman baths actually clean? The Roman baths, or thermae, were magnificent public institutions. They were far more than just places to get clean. They were social centers with libraries, gyms, gardens, and food stalls. For a small fee, anyone could enter. You would move through a series of rooms with pools of different temperatures, the frigidarium cold, the tepidarium warm, and the caldarium hot. It was a place for business, relaxation, and socializing. The baths of Caracalla in Rome could hold over 1,600 bathers at a time. But were they hygienic? Almost certainly not. The Romans did not use soap in the way we do. To get clean, they would cover their bodies in oil and then use a curved metal scraper called a strigil to scrape off the oil, dirt, and sweat. This mixture of gunk would fall to the floor or be collected by slaves. The water in the pools was not chlorinated and was changed infrequently, perhaps only once a day or less. The large public pools would have been, as the physician Celsus noted, a breeding ground for germs. People with open sores, skin diseases, and infectious illnesses all bathed together in the same shared water. Seneca the Younger, who lived in an apartment above a bathhouse, complained in one of his letters about the noise, the grunts of the weightlifters, the slap of the masseur's hand, and the enthusiast who likes to hear his own voice in the bath. He also describes the water as filthy. Archaeological studies have backed this up. Analysis of silt from drains in Roman bathhouses has found evidence of human lice and intestinal parasites, indicating that the water was contaminated with fecal matter. The caldarium, the hot room, was essentially a giant, warm petri dish, ideal for cultivating bacteria. While the Romans were famous for their engineering, their understanding of public health and microbiology was non-existent. They saw disease as being caused by miasma or bad air, not by microscopic organisms in the water. So, while a trip to the baths might have been a relaxing social ritual, it was also a gamble with your health. You could go in for a pleasant soak and come out with an eye infection, a skin disease, or a nasty case of gastroenteritis. This leads to some interesting questions. Did the Romans notice a link between visiting the baths and getting sick, or did they just accept a certain level of illness as normal? Were there any rules of etiquette regarding personal hygiene, or was it a complete free-for-all? And given that the water was so dirty, did people leave the baths feeling cleaner, or did they just leave covered in a new layer of other people's grime? Number 9. What was the true cost of bread in circuses? The Roman games are infamous for their scale and brutality. The policy of bread in circuses, a phrase coined by the poet Juvenal, referred to the state's method of keeping the massive unemployed population of Rome docile and entertained with free grain and spectacular, violent entertainment. The Flavian Amphitheater, better known as the Colosseum, could hold an estimated 50,000 to 80,000 spectators. The Circus Maximus, used for chariot races, had a capacity of over 150,000. These events were state-sponsored spectacles of power, reinforcing the social order and distracting the masses from their poverty. Gladiatorial combat was the main event. Most gladiators were slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals. They were trained in special schools or ludi under incredibly harsh conditions. While a successful gladiator could become a celebrity with a huge following and great wealth, the vast majority died young and forgotten. Their lives were completely at the mercy of the crowd, and the editor, the sponsor of the games. A thumbs-down gesture paulus verso from the crowd likely meant death. The sand of the arena floor was there to soak up the blood. But gladiators were not the only ones to die in the arena. The games often began with venations or wild animal hunts. Thousands of exotic animals, lions, tigers, elephants, bears, rhinos, were captured and shipped from across the empire to be slaughtered in the arena. The environmental devastation was immense. Some species, like the North African elephant, were hunted to extinction. Even more horrifying were the public executions. Condemned criminals, known as Noxi, were executed in gruesome and theatrical ways as part of the day's entertainment. They might be thrown to wild beast damnatio ad bestias, burned alive on a stake, or forced to reenact gruesome myths which always ended in their real death. The crucifixion was a common punishment reserved for slaves and non-citizens, designed to be a slow, agonizing, and humiliating public spectacle. The crucifixion of thousands of Spartacus's followers along the Appian Way in 71 BC was a stark warning to anyone who dared to challenge Roman power. The audience, including women and children, would watch these real deaths as a form of entertainment. It was a society desensitized to a level of violence that is almost impossible for us to comprehend. This normalization of extreme brutality raises some deeply disturbing questions. What psychological effect did watching real people and animals being slaughtered for entertainment have on the Roman population? Did it make them more violent and cruel in their own lives? We know that the games were a tool of political control, but did the emperors themselves enjoy the bloodshed, or did they just see it as a necessary part of the job? And what did the gladiators, the men forced to kill for the crowd's pleasure, think as they stood on the bloody sand, waiting for the signal to fight? Number 8. How did the super rich live while others starved? The gap between the rich and the poor in ancient Rome was not just a gap, it was a chasm. At the very top was a tiny class of senators and equestrians who controlled almost all the wealth and land. At the bottom was the vast mass of the urban poor and a huge population of slaves. There was very little in between. The wealthy lived in opulent private homes or domuses with multiple rooms, central courtyards, beautiful mosaics, and even private baths and running water. The remains of these luxurious houses in Pompeii and Herculaneum give us a glimpse of their lavish lifestyle. Their days were filled with leisure. A wealthy Roman man would spend his morning receiving clients, his afternoon at the baths, and his evening at a lavish dinner party, a convivium. These dinners were legendary for their excess. The book Sina Trimalchione's Trimalchio's Dinner from Petronius' Satyricon satirizes these events. It describes a grotesquely rich freedman who serves his guests course after course of absurdly extravagant food, such as a whole boar stuffed with live thrushes that fly out when it's carved. While this is a satire, it reflects a reality of competitive consumption. The wealthy displayed their status through the exoticism of their food, the number of slaves they owned, and the splendor of their homes. Meanwhile, the poor lived crammed into the insulae, the poorly built apartment blocks. A whole family might live in a single small dark room with no kitchen or toilet. They had no job security, working as day laborers on construction sites or in the docks. Their diet was meager, and they were constantly at risk of disease, fire, and eviction. Their only hope for a better life was the patronage of a wealthy Roman. The patron-client system was a cornerstone of Roman society. In the morning, a poor Roman client would go to the home of his wealthy patronuses to pay his respects. In return for his loyalty and his vote, the client would receive a small handout of food, the sportula, and perhaps some legal help. This system reinforced the social hierarchy and made the poor dependent on the rich for their very survival. It was a world of extreme visible and accepted inequality. This stark contrast forces us to question the stability of Roman society. With such a massive population of poor and desperate people, why weren't there more rebellions and revolutions? Was the system of bread and circuses and patronage enough to keep a lid on social unrest? We also have to wonder about the moral and psychological world of the Roman elite. How did they justify their extreme wealth while living surrounded by such abject poverty? Did they see it as their right, a sign of divine favor, or did some of them feel a sense of guilt or social responsibility? Number 7, could you be a slave and never know freedom? Slavery was the engine that powered the Roman economy. It was everywhere and touched every aspect of life. At the height of the empire, it is estimated that as many as 1/3 of the population of Italy were slaves. This was a slave society on a scale rarely seen in human history. Slaves were not considered people, they were property, or what the agricultural writer Varro called instrumentum vocae, talking tools. They had no rights, could not legally marry, and their children were automatically the property of their owner. People became slaves in several ways. The most common was being captured in war. Rome's relentless military expansion provided a constant supply of human property. Others were born into slavery, the children of slave mothers. Some were victims of piracy or kidnapping, and some were abandoned children who were found and raised as slaves. Life as a slave varied enormously depending on your job. The worst fate was to be sent to the mines or the large agricultural estates, the latifundia. Here, slaves worked in chain gangs under brutal conditions, often until they died from exhaustion or malnutrition. The agricultural writer Cato the Elder, in his manual De Agricultura, advises owners to sell off old or sick slaves, just as they would a worn-out ox. In the cities, a slave's life could be better, but it was still one of total subjugation. They worked as household servants, cooks, cleaners, and tutors. Some educated Greek slaves were highly valued as doctors, scribes, or managers. But even in the best situations, a slave was always at the mercy of their owner's whims. They could be beaten, tortured, or sexually exploited without any legal recourse. The law stated that if a slave owner was murdered by one of his slaves, all the slaves in the household had to be executed, even the innocent ones. In 61 AD, when the city prefect Lucius Pedanius Secundus was murdered by a slave, the Senate, despite public protests, ordered the execution of all 400 slaves in his household, including women and children. This was done, as the historian Tacitus explains, to set an example and terrify other slaves into obedience. While some slaves were granted their freedom and admission by grateful owners, the vast majority lived and died in bondage. The sheer scale and brutality of Roman slavery leave us with some fundamental questions. How did Roman society function with such a large, oppressed, and potentially rebellious population in its midst? The massive revolt led by the gladiator Spartacus in 73 to 71 BC showed how dangerous this could be. More profoundly, how did the institution of slavery affect the Roman character? Did the absolute power they held over other human beings make them more arrogant, cruel, and decadent? And what was the emotional and psychological toll on the slaves themselves living a life without hope, family, or freedom? Number 6, how did anyone survive childhood? Childhood in ancient Rome was brief and perilous. The single greatest challenge was simply staying alive. As mentioned, infant and child mortality rates were staggeringly high. Diseases we now vaccinate against, like measles and smallpox, were rampant killers. Malnutrition, poor sanitation, and contaminated water meant that children were constantly exposed to life-threatening infections. Families had many children, not just out of a desire for a large family, but in the grim knowledge that many of them would not survive to adulthood. The Roman world was filled with grieving parents. The abundance of tombstones for young children, often with heartbreaking inscriptions, attests to this constant loss. If a child survived infancy, their upbringing was shaped by their social class and gender. For the wealthy, a child would be raised by nurses and educated by tutors, often Greek slaves. For the poor, childhood ended quickly. Children were expected to contribute to the family income as soon as they were able. They would work on farms, in shops, or as servants. There were no child labor laws. The concept of childhood as a protected and innocent phase of life did not really exist. Children were seen as miniature adults, and they were exposed to all the harsh realities of Roman life, including the violence of the arena and the squalor of the streets. Discipline was strict and often physical. The authority of the paterfamilias was absolute. Your Roman education, for those who received it, emphasized rote memorization and was often enforced with corporal punishment. The poet Horace refers to his teacher Orbilius as Plagosis, or the flogger. Toys and games existed. We have found dolls, toy soldiers, and board games. So children did have moments of play, but the overall environment was one where life was cheap and hardship was the norm. The practice of infant exposure also casts a dark shadow. A child's very existence depended on the father's acceptance. To be a child in Rome was to be in a constant state of vulnerability to both disease and the decisions of the adults around you. This precarious existence raises some deeply human questions. How did the constant death of children shape the parent-child bond? Did parents try to remain emotionally distant from their infants to protect themselves from the inevitable grief? We also have to wonder about the children who were abandoned but survived, picked up by slave traders or others. What kind of life did they have, growing up with the knowledge that their own parents had discarded them? And how did surviving such a dangerous childhood shape the Roman adult, making them perhaps tougher, more fatalistic, and less sentimental than we are today? Number 5, could you trust the army to protect you? The Roman army was one of the most effective fighting forces in history. It conquered and controlled a vast empire for centuries. But for the people living within that empire, the soldiers were not always a welcome sight. The army was a tool of Roman power, and it could be just as oppressive to the provincials it was supposed to protect as it was to the enemies it fought. Soldiers were often billeted in private homes, a requirement that was deeply resented by the local population. They had to be fed and supplied by the local communities, a heavy economic burden. And the behavior of soldiers, often far from home and armed with immense authority, was not always good. There are numerous accounts of soldiers extorting money, stealing property, and assaulting civilians. The army was also a major political player. After the reforms of Marius in the late 2nd century BC, soldiers became loyal not to the state, but to their individual generals who promised them land and money. This led to a series of devastating civil wars that destroyed the Roman Republic. Generals like Sulla, Caesar, and Pompey used their legions to march on Rome itself. The infamous Year of the Four Emperors in 69 AD saw 4 different generals use their armies to seize the throne in rapid succession, plunging the empire into chaos. The Praetorian Guard, the elite unit stationed in Rome supposedly to protect the emperor, became notorious for assassinating emperors they disliked and installing their own candidates. They were kingmakers and king breakers, a constant threat at the heart of the empire. For the ordinary Roman, the army was a double-edged sword. It kept the borders safe from barbarian invasions, but it could also be the source of civil war and oppression. The military was a brutal institution. Discipline was incredibly harsh. A soldier who fell asleep on watch could be clubbed to death by his own comrades. In cases of mutiny or cowardice, a unit could be subjected to decimation. This meant the soldiers would be divided into groups of 10, and each group would draw lots. The unlucky one would be beaten to death by the other 9. This was a terrifying tool of control used to enforce obedience through pure fear. The army that brought the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, did so through an institutionalized and ruthless application of violence, both external and internal. This brings up some critical questions about power and control. How did the average citizen view the soldiers? As protectors or as an occupying force? When civil war broke out, how did a normal person choose a side, knowing that picking the loser could mean the loss of their property and their life? And ultimately, was the Roman army the guardian of the empire, or was it the very thing that, through its constant political interference and civil wars, eventually helped to tear it apart? Number 4, what did justice look like in the arena? The Roman legal system is often cited as one of its greatest contributions to Western civilization. Concepts like the presumption of innocence and the need for evidence have their roots in Roman law. But the reality of justice in Rome was heavily dependent on your social status. For the wealthy and powerful, the law was a tool to be used and manipulated. They could afford the best lawyers and orators, and their trials held in the basilica were complex affairs. But for the poor, the lower classes, humiliores, and non-citizens, justice was a much more brutal and summary affair. If you were a poor Roman accused of a serious crime, you had few rights. You could be tortured to extract a confession, something that was legally forbidden for upper-class citizens except in cases of treason. The punishments were also starkly different. A wealthy person convicted of a crime might face a fine, confiscation of property, or exile. A poor person convicted of the same crime could be sentenced to the mines, to be crucified, or to be thrown to the beasts in the arena. The courts were not impartial. A judge's decision could be swayed by the social standing of the accused, by bribes, or by political pressure. The most extreme form of this class-based justice was the use of the arena as a place of execution. The damnatio ad bestias, being condemned to the beasts, was a common punishment for serious crimes like murder, arson, and treason, but only for the lower classes. The condemned would be sent into the arena, unarmed, to be torn apart by starved lions, bears, or other wild animals, all for the entertainment of the crowd. This turned the act of legal punishment into a gruesome public spectacle. It was a powerful and terrifying message from the state. This is what happens when you defy Roman authority. The law was not just about justice, it was about maintaining social order through terror. The stark difference between how the rich honestiores and the poor humiliores were treated in the legal system shows that the famous Roman ideal of equality before the law was largely a fiction. This system of justice raises some fundamental questions. Did the average Roman believe this system was fair, or did they see it for the brutal, class-based system it was? How did the practice of public execution as entertainment shape their view of the law? Did it make them respect the state's power more, or did it just breed a cynical and brutalized populace? And what did it mean to live in a society where your wealth and status, not your guilt or innocence, were the primary determinants of whether you lived or died? Number three, how did a world without privacy work? The modern concept of privacy was almost entirely absent in ancient Rome. Life was lived in public, in the open, and in close proximity to others. This started in the home itself. For the vast majority of people living in the insulae, a single room served as the living, sleeping, and eating space for an entire family. There was no personal space. Wealthy homes, the domuses, were designed around a central atrium and peristyle courtyard. They were open to the air and to the constant flow of people, family members, slaves, and clients. The front door was often left open during the day. Business was conducted in the atrium in full view of the household. This lack of privacy extended to all aspects of life. The public baths were a place where people of all classes mixed naked for hours. The public toilets were communal social centers. The streets were a constant press of bodies. The walls of Roman buildings in places like Pompeii are covered in graffiti, a very public expression of personal opinions, jokes, and advertisements. Even personal matters like marriage and divorce were public affairs involving contracts and ceremonies that solidified social standing. The Roman moral code was also enforced by public opinion. A person's fama, or reputation, was incredibly important. You were constantly being watched and judged by your neighbors, your clients, and your peers. A rumor or a scandal could ruin you. The political writer Cicero's letters are full of gossip and commentary on the private lives of his rivals. This lack of privacy meant a lack of anonymity. In the crowded city, everyone knew everyone else's business. This could provide a sense of community and social support, but it could also be oppressive. It meant that your life was not entirely your own. Your actions, your choices, and even your failures were public knowledge. For the emperors, this was taken to the extreme. Their lives were a public performance. The historian Suetonius's The 12 Caesars is filled with intimate and often scandalous details about the emperor's personal habits, health, and sex lives, all of which were apparently common knowledge and a subject of intense public interest. In the Roman world, there was no clear line between the public and the private self. This fundamentally different way of living makes us wonder about their inner lives. Without a concept of personal space or privacy, did Romans have a different understanding of the self? Was it possible to have secrets in a world where everyone was watching? And did the constant social pressure to maintain a good reputation create a society of actors where everyone was playing a role and hiding their true feelings behind a public mask? Number two, what was the smell of Rome? If you could travel back in time to ancient Rome, the first thing that would hit you is the smell. It would be an overwhelming, multi-layered assault on the senses. Rome was a city of 1 million people packed into a small area with no modern sanitation. The streets were filled with garbage. People threw their household waste directly into the alleys. Animal carcasses would be left to rot. And as mentioned, the contents of chamber pots were often emptied out of windows. The streets were essentially open sewers. The famous Cloaca Maxima, the Great Sewer of Rome, was primarily a drainage system to carry away stormwater, not a sealed sanitary sewer for human waste. While some public latrines and wealthy homes were connected to it, most of the city's filth ended up in the streets and eventually washed into the Tiber River. The river itself would have been incredibly polluted. It was the city's main water source for washing and industry, and also its primary dumping ground. The waste from tanneries, which used animal urine and feces in the tanning process, and from butcher shops would have flowed directly into the river. The smell of the Tiber in the summer heat must have been appalling. Add to this the constant smell of animals. Carts were pulled by oxen and mules, which would have left their droppings everywhere. In the markets, the smell of, live animals, slaughtered meat, and rotting vegetables would have mixed. The fish markets would have reeked of garum, the fermented fish sauce, a smell that would have permeated entire neighborhoods. Then there was the smell of the living and the dead. In the crowded insula, with poor ventilation, the smell of unwashed bodies, cooking fumes, and smoke from oil lamps would have been suffocating. Funerary processions were a common sight, and while the wealthy were buried in tombs outside the city walls, the poor were often dumped into mass burial pits, puticuli, just outside the city. The writer Horace describes one of these as a place littered with whitening bones. And of course, there was the smell of the games, the sweat and fear of thousands of people packed into the Colosseum, the metallic scent of blood, the stench of animal entrails, and the smell of burning bodies from public executions. The Romans tried to combat these smells with incense in their temples and perfumes on their bodies, but these would have done little to mask the underlying reality. Rome was a city that reeked of life, death, and decay. This olfactory reality forces us to ask some practical questions. How did people get used to such a powerful and unpleasant smell? Did they just become desensitized to it, or was it a constant source of misery? We also have to wonder how this ever-present filth contributed to the spread of disease. Was the bad air, the miasma that they believed caused plagues, a pre-scientific recognition that the very air they breathed was filled with the agents of death? And could the desire of the wealthy to escape the city in the summer for their countryside villas have been driven as much by a need to escape the stench as the heat? At number one, did anyone feel safe? The answer is almost certainly no. Life in ancient Rome, for everyone from the emperor to the lowest slave, was fundamentally precarious. It was a world defined by uncertainty, violence, and a constant proximity to death. Your physical safety was never guaranteed. You could be mugged on a dark street, killed by a falling chamber pot, or perish in a sudden fire that consumed your home. You could be the victim of a political purge, accused of treason by an informer, and executed without a fair trial. You could be a soldier in the Civil War, forced to fight against your fellow Romans, and killed for a cause you barely understood. You could be a slave, living every moment under the threat of your owner's casual brutality. Your health was constantly at risk. A small cut could lead to a fatal infection. A fever could be a death sentence. Childbirth was a life-threatening event for women. The water you drank might be slowly poisoning you with lead. The public baths where you went to relax could be teeming with disease. Plagues and epidemics periodically swept through the empire, killing millions and leaving cities half empty. The Antonine Plague in the 2nd century AD, likely a form of smallpox, may have killed up to a quarter of the population. There was no scientific understanding of these events, only fear and the belief that the gods were angry. Your social and economic position was also unstable. A wealthy family could lose everything overnight due to political disfavor or a failed business venture. A poor farmer could be driven off his land by debt and forced to join the desperate urban mob in Rome. Even the emperors, the most powerful men in the world, lived in constant fear. Of the dozens of emperors who ruled Rome, a huge proportion were assassinated, forced to commit suicide, or killed in battle. The Emperor Domitian was so paranoid that he had the walls of his porticos lined with polished stone so he could see if anyone was sneaking up behind him. His paranoia was justified. He was eventually assassinated by members of his own court. This was the reality of the Pax Romana. It was a peace maintained by a brutal military and a system of law that favored the powerful. But for the individual, it was not a world that felt peaceful or safe. It was a world where disaster, in one form or another, was always just around the corner. This leads to the most fundamental and unsettling questions of all. How did people find meaning and hope in such a dangerous and uncertain world? Was it through religion, philosophy, family, or simply the grim determination to survive another day? When we strip away the marble and the monuments, we find a society that was, at its core, deeply anxious and fragile. And we are left to wonder how much of our own world, with all its technological and social progress, is still built on the same foundations of inequality, violence, and uncertainty that define the daily, unsettling reality of ancient Rome.